The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer. St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on The Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Chris McDaniel, a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. Joining me in studio is...
an unsubpoenaed Jason Rosenbaum.
Timely. And
Joe Mannies.
And our special guest this week?
State Representative Tracy McCreery.
Yes, actually in studio this time.
Yes, which is great because we don't have to trip over their words when we can't really see them. That's one of the secret downfalls of doing it remotely.
However, we'll be doing a number of those remote ones this session, and hopefully our listeners will enjoy them. They're mainly, we'll notice it more than you do because of the powers of technological advances.
Yeah.
The audio should sound pretty good.
But nothing beats an in-person, politically speaking.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what everyone says. But let's talk about you. So you are a representative. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got there.
Oh, and your district, too.
Oh, sure. So I represent portions of mid-St. Louis County. I reside in Olivet, and my district includes a lot of Creve Coeur, some Town and Country, some Frontenac, and I go all the way out to Chesterfield, a little bit past 141. I have kind of East Chesterfield,
Officially,
if you will.
what's the number of your district?
It's District 88.
Okay.
Yep, and I'm actually considered a red shirt freshman in the legislature this year. I was fortunate to have served 1 year back in 2012. I ran in a special election in the fall of 2011 and served a year that was left on somebody's open seat.
And not to get too in the weeds, but
Right.
because I guess you were inaugurated, after January 1st or something, you get to run for 3 more terms. You're not limited.
Right, so if I would decide to run, I could serve a total of 9 years.
Yes, so that's kind of rare in the term-limited era, but it's one of the quirks of term limits.
Wasn't there some other quirks about your 1 year?
Well, we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay, well, go ahead.
But first, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into politics.
Sure. So I actually grew up in rural northern Ohio, and I went to the Ohio State University, and I moved here.
It's important to say the. Apparently, people who went there get kind of upset if you don't include the. So.
It's a the with a capital
including
T.
our general manager, Tim Eby.
I knew I liked him. Anyway, I moved to St. Louis right after I graduated from college to take a job in the pharmaceutical industry. So I've been in the St. Louis area for about 25 years.
And you are a Joan Bray alum.
I am, yeah. I had the honor of working for State Senator Joan Bray for the entire 8 years she was in the Missouri Senate. And it was a life opportunity, and I learned a lot, and that's really where I decided that I wanted to move from being a behind-the-scenes person to being an upfront person like I am.
Now, what did you do for Bray? What was your official title?
I was officially her district aide, so I ran her district office here in the St. Louis County region, and that was just to give her more of a local presence because, as you know, the senators are often in Jefferson City Monday through Friday, but there were a lot of things going on back here in her home district that needed her attention, so I was her eyes and ears on the ground here.
One of the things that's always fascinated me about former Senator Bray is she was probably one of the strongest progressive legislators in the Senate. She was very upfront about her views on abortion rights, gun control, campaign finance. But I also got a sense that because she was on the Appropriations Committee and because I think she fostered a pretty good relationship, especially with former Senator Gary Nodler, she was able to be fairly influential as a budget appropriator, even though she was in the minority. Was that kind of a fair assumption?
It is a fair assumption. She was the ranking Democratic member in Senate Appropriations, and she took that very, very seriously. And because I think that people really respected her knowledge and her mastery of the budget process. And again, she was authentic. It's like you always knew where she stood. And I remember watching Senator Bray on panels and things through the years, and I will tell you, she never had a poker face. You always knew exactly what she thought about an issue or a topic.
Which is kind of the magic of the Senate. You may not win every battle, but you can still be influential even when you're in the minority because, senators are more powerful. And I think Senator Bray used that to her advantage many times.
Yeah, and for full disclosure, Senator Bray and I worked together for a number of years at the Post-Dispatch in her earlier career, and I can say that she was a tightwad, which is probably why she was good with the budget process.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I will never, ever take another job with someone who's a former editor either. I hated getting pieces of writing started for her because she would go at it with a red pen, and I'd get all sweaty, and she would just tear my writing apart.
But she's a good writer.
Oh, she's a great writer, yeah.
So in 2011, so to kind of take the veil off what we were alluding to earlier, then State Representative Jake Zimmerman successfully ran for St. Louis County Assessor, which caused a vacancy in his district, which was, I guess, a slightly different district because of redistricting, but I think it was pretty much mid St. Louis County. And it was an interesting situation because when there's a vacancy for a state legislative spot, the party committees end up choosing the nominee. And they ended up choosing somebody else. By they, I mean the Democrats. And you decided to run as an independent, and you actually won as an independent.
Yeah, much to my surprise.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about that experience.
Well, I will do that. A lot of this is sort of that insider politics things that I think a lot of your listeners like.
Well, yeah.
They laughed it out.
So I like to say that I got a majority of the support from the committee men and women that were in that process. I had support of 7 of the 10 people in the evening when they met to select their Democratic candidate. But because the votes were weighted,
yes,
the person and the person who ultimately got the Democratic nod was able to vote for himself that evening too. So I did not get the nod that night when the committee men and women met. And some things came out at that meeting dealing with Missouri ethics violations and such, and the more I thought about it, I just wasn't really sure that the voters in the district would be comfortable voting for a Democrat that had outstanding fines for the Missouri Ethics Commission.
And who are we talking about here?
Jeff O'Connell is his name. Yep.
So you ended up prevailing. I remember that race a little bit. There was a little bit of trepidation that when there were 2 Democratic candidates, it might split the vote and the Republican may win. I know that district pretty well. It's a fairly heavily Democratic district, so I was always a little leery of that scenario, but it has happened before. I remember in 2005, that's what happened with that Jeffco Senate seat, and we had Senator Bill Alter, but you ended up being there for about a year.
Yep, I was there for a year. Interesting, too, in that special election, the fall of 2011, the Republicans did 2 mailers on my behalf. One was a piece that was supposed to look negative, but it actually was a veiled positive piece about me. And then one was a true negative where it showed me kind of dancing with President Obama.
So so they basically pulled a Claire McCaskill.
Mm-hmm.
So
actually, it should be Claire McCaskill pulled a
Tracy, right? Exactly.
Tracy McCreery.
But so after redistricting, you decided to run as a Democrat in what is what district was it?
It was District 71.
District 71. It was an open seat because it didn't have a representative.
Right. So during redistricting, when the new maps came out in 2012, I was placed in the same district as State Representative Jill Shube. I'm a good friend of hers. She actually was a mentor to me that year I was in the Missouri House, and I decided I was not going to run against her. She just is a marvelous Democrat, and we have pretty much identical voting
and
records.
Also, as we found out last year, she's pretty good at running campaigns.
Yes, she's marvelous at running campaigns. So the party and those and others in power encouraged me to run for an open seat about a half a mile north of where I live. North of Olive Boulevard was the dividing line of the 2 districts. So I ran in a district that I did not reside in. And I was able to do that because the maps came out so late that, it wasn't like I was doing anything suspicious. You're allowed to.
Other people did that too, so it wasn't super unusual.
Right, people from both parties did that pretty much. So I ran in a seat that I didn't reside in and lost mainly because I was an outsider.
Yeah,
so.
You lost. It was to current Representative Sue Meredith. So you're part of this group of people who in the legislature you ran against each other at one time and now serve at the same time. But what did you kind of learn from that experience?
Yes.
We had talked about this before for an article that I was writing, but it does seem like when people lose an election, it gives them a lot of perspective of how to run another one.
Yeah. Well, the good thing about the race that I ran and lost is I knew the day after the election that I wouldn't have done anything differently. I couldn't have worked any harder. And that's the one way you can really live with a loss is if you don't second guess yourself the whole time. But, not to get too spiritual about all of this, but, I would have been probably 46 6 at the time that this happened, and I sort of wish I'd learned this life lesson much earlier in life, that you can actually try something, give it all you've got, and lose, and publicly lose. You know, when you run for office, it's not the same as like losing your job and only a couple people know about it. Like, I lost my job publicly. It was on the news. It was in the paper. It was on this radio station. You know, and what I realized is I could lose but not feel like a loser, and it was a really valuable life lesson, and I wish I would have learned it 25 years ago.
In the interim, you actually worked for Promo, which
Yes.
is the state's top LGBT advocacy group.
Mm-hmm.
It was during a pretty busy time during that for that community.
Yes.
Yeah, because this is when they were getting a lot of pro-LGBT provisions in various communities in St. Louis County and elsewhere in the state.
And then DOMA was struck down as
Right.
well.
Correct.
Yeah, so we had all kinds of positive things happening for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, both in the state of Missouri, locally, but also at the national level as well. I think will be probably the best job that I've ever had when I look back on all of my jobs at the end of my life. It was an amazing time to be involved in a pro-equality movement, and I learned a lot. My job was actually focused on health equity, this idea that those that are members of a minority group have poorer health outcomes. So the Missouri Foundation for Health is very interested in reducing health disparities amongst minorities here in the state of Missouri. So they funded this project that I worked on through Promo.
So fast forward, I guess, to last year.
2014.
Representative Shoup has decided to run for Senate, which leaves her district open. You didn't have a primary.
No.
And you ran against a gentleman named Raymond Chancellor. It was
Chandler.
I'm sorry, Raymond Chandler. I mispronounced your name. And
He had the same name as the novelist?
Yes.
Wow.
And that's how you always knew you were talking to a sophisticated voter, when they would put that together.
And this was kind of an interesting situation because I know that district relatively well because I have family in kind of western central St. Louis County, and it's not like a safe Democratic district, so you actually have to work on it when it's open. But it wasn't really like a targeted Republican race because they were kind of focusing their attention on taking out Vicki England or Bill Otto, or trying to keep that Kirkwood seat. So when we were talking a couple of months ago, it seemed like it was a much different atmosphere than what like Vicki England or Bill Otto was going through. Is that basically a fair assumption?
Yeah, it's a fair assumption. This race, it's the seat I'm in is by no means a totally safe Democratic seat, but the Democratic Party wasn't going to help me, but yet the Republicans also weren't willing to take their resources and put them in.
But didn't it help from the standpoint that your district was within a Senate district, which was arguably the most competitive Senate district as far as both sides pouring in a bunch of money after Jay Ashcroft came in as the Republican in the state, or at least in the St. Louis area?
Yeah.
I mean,
well, I'm convinced that the reason the turnout was so high in my state rep race is because for a lot of people, Jill Shoup was the biggest race in the state, not just in our region here. I mean, it was really the only Senate seat where we had a chance to turn a Republican seat back to a Democratic seat. So Jill's early support of me, the moment she decided to run for Senate, she was publicly supporting me to fill her shoes in the House. Her early support and the team spirit that her campaign team exhibited towards me, I'm sure helped me. I won't say ease into victory, because I did knock on 10,000 doors. Right. I made 2 loops through the district.
I also think it helped Steve Stenger win. I mean, I think he owes a huge debt to how well of a campaign Jill Shoup ran. Because if she would have not run as good of a campaign as she did and raise all that money and win by 4 or 5 percentage points, I think he would have lost.
Well, it wasn't an accident. We actually had a coordinated campaign for the Democratic races in the county that were going to be tight. So it wasn't opened up to, like a Clem Smith who's in an 80% district. But those districts that the Democratic Party was worried about, we met every Friday and figured out a way we could help each other. So, for example, the night before the election, I took all of Steve Stenger's signs to polling places in my district as well, just to help.
So there you go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because this is one of those cases where it's not just the percentage of victory, it's also the numbers. Because, if she had not had a strong turnout in that district, I mean, forgetting, because like you mentioned, Clem Smith or some others, they may not have had a strong turnout because they figured
Well, they were unopposed, basically.
Right. But my point is, so you have residents in that district who may or may not had been wanting to vote otherwise since he wasn't threatened. Maybe they were upset with Stanger Stream or whatever. But the point being that this was a case where, because there was a high number turnout in the Shoup-Ashcroft district, that very fact may very well have put Stanger over the finish line, because they only won by 1,800 votes.
Yeah. So we could go into memory lane for a long time, but let's kind of shift into
we're junkies
the here and now. So you've co-sponsored legislation with Representative Kevin Austin of Springfield that's aimed at protecting victims of human trafficking. I read the summary before the show, and it basically places victims of human trafficking on the Secretary of State's basically do not publish address list. Is that correct?
It's a program called Safe at Home, and it's an address confidentiality program that's administered by the Secretary of State's office.
Tell me why you think it's an important thing to do.
Well, it's another important step that Missouri can take to protect victims of human trafficking. I have been working on anti-human trafficking measures for almost a decade now through my work with Senator Bray. Back about a decade ago, Senators Bray and Senator Matt Bartle out of the Kansas City area co-sponsored and passed Missouri's first anti-human trafficking laws. And so it started out that Senator Bray told me I needed to get involved in anti-human trafficking work back here in the district to kind of pump up and supplement the work she was doing at the legislative level. So I've been working on this issue for about a decade. This House Bill 368 and the companion Senate bill is Senate Bill 211. These are things that we can do to continue to help victims in their road to recovery. What we heard from counselors and groups that help trafficking victims is they need to find a way to have a fresh start and a new life away from their traffickers. And sometimes that means you need to keep your address private.
And this is an interesting issue, because this is one of those unusual issues where you have a lot of Republicans involved, like Congresswoman Ann Wagner. This is one of her big issues, and she's rising Republican in St. Louis County. Why do you think that this issue is one of those few ones that seems to be gathering strength across party lines? Luke DeMeyer, for example, has put out some stuff this week about it.
Well, in the Missouri legislative level, I think that that it truly is a sincerely bipartisan effort. I'm not so sure at the federal level that all of that came out of the goodness of people's hearts. I think that the Republican at the federal level, their work on anti-human trafficking work came after they had been accused for months and months of their war on women. So I'm not 100% convinced that it's authentic at the federal level. But with my colleagues in the Missouri House and the Missouri Senate, I feel like it's sincerely a bipartisan effort. It comes from the heart. We might come at it from different reasons. I remember thinking, that Senator Bray came at her opposition to trafficking more from a human rights standpoint, where Senator Bartle came at it more from a Christian value standpoint, but we still agree that trafficking is wrong, that human slavery is wrong.
And I guess that bill got across the finish line.
Yep.
So, again, that's an example of, Democrats and Republicans working together, probably on the exact opposite ideological planes.
Exactly, because Bray and Bartles, you couldn't get much more different on other issues.
Yeah, and that, at the press conference that Secretary of State Kander hosted this week, it was a true bipartisan group of bill sponsors standing up there, and I'm confident we can get it done this year.
So another thing that you've sponsored is ethics legislation. You're one of many legislators who are kind of tackling that issue. Chris has obviously been following this from the lobbyist perspective. Right. Joe and I have been following campaign finance-related stuff, as has Chris. What's kind of the bill that you introduced in a nutshell, and what's kind of your general feel that not only that ethics legislation will pass, but whether it'll be impactful? Because there have been ethics bills that have passed in the last 10 years that frankly haven't been that impactful at changing things. So what's kind of your take on the situation?
Well, I hate to hear your cynicism. That just, I guess that's your journalistic...
I'm a little cynical on this issue.
Yeah. I'm hopeful that the voters are, because of a lot of great coverage by responsible media out there, I think the voters have really had it and are disgusted by Missouri's lack of limits on lobbyist gifts, for example. We're the only state in the nation where there's no limit on what a lobbyist can give you. And, I think there's a big difference between getting a free pen from the Missouri Corn Growers Association and getting 4 tickets to the World Series. Anybody with half a brain knows there's a difference between a free pen and World Series tickets. So, I would like to see, and I've proposed limits on what lobbyists can give to legislators.
Here's why I was cynical, because back when I was working for the Columbia Tribune, I was writing about how they had closed this loophole where they gave gifts to caucuses. And I'm not talking about Republican and Democratic caucuses. I'm talking about like the Cowboy Caucus and the 200 Annex Caucus, which was basically used to shield lobbyist gifts. And after that, they were like, when they got rid of that, they're like, okay, it's going to be completely out in the open. But as Chris has reported, the concealment hasn't stopped. I think it's probably gotten worse.
It's gone up, actually. We had a story that the trend is the vast majority of it is going to groups as opposed to individuals. So it's definitely not a trend that's going away anytime soon.
So how do you kind of play this game of whack-a-mole effectively?
Yeah,
essentially?
and that's a great analogy. I think that as citizens, because I'm a voter myself and want to see as good of government as we can get. We can't let, just because we can't make something perfect doesn't mean we can't try to take steps in the right direction. And I think we just have to keep a constant vigil on these things and not let people get away with things. I think Speaker Deal took a good step when he became speaker by not allowing the gifts and the dinners and such just to go to a committee. You now have to put the people's names on who is getting the free steak dinner or whatever.
But just this week we had Country Club Gate, basically.
Yeah. The Jefferson County Country Club, which
Jefferson City.
Yes, Jefferson
I'm sure
City.
the Jefferson.
They didn't travel to Jefferson
I'm sure the
County.
Jefferson County Country Club is beautiful, but probably not as good as Jefferson City.
And that country club shows up a lot on lobbyist disclosures, and there was a House hearing that was held there. After it was held, it got a lot of media attention, and then that is when Representative Deal said, all right, we're not going to do that anymore.
I think he had basically said, though, before the session started that there was not going to be these committee hearings in restaurants. And, I kind of understand why you do that initially. Mm-hmm. Maybe you want to, have the committee members get to know each other better, maybe talk about things informally. And I guess you got to make it open because of sunshine laws if everybody's there. Yeah. But, this kind of seemed pretty extreme,
Well, and the country club just sends the wrong message. It'd be different. You could do the same kind of thing in an Applebee's or something, and at least it's a more, approachable kind of venue. I just think it sends the wrong message, especially because the people funding the dinner, so that Tuesday night meeting was for the Telecommunications Committee in the Missouri House, and then the dinner was funded by people from the telecommunications industry. The people were supposed to be regulating
about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so it would be another thing if they were all meeting at the country club and everybody was, if it was Dutch Treat.
Right.
Or at Applebee's or wherever.
And that's in effect what I do. So I do go to group dinners off-site because that is the only time you get a chance to really get to know the people you work with. Mm-hmm. One of the bad things about term limits, in my opinion, is there's not motivation for a lot of people to get to know their colleagues. Before term limits, Senator Bray was in office for 18 years. I mean, she went canoeing with people. She went on vacation with people from the other side of the aisle. They had true connections and friendships and relationships, and I really see that missing. So that being said, I do go to group dinners that are held off-site, but then I use my own personal money, not my campaign money, to pay for my own meal. And that's really the only time you get a chance to talk to someone in the other party and find out, how many kids do you have, what do you like to do when you're not here in Jeff City, that kind of thing.
And it's also important for you as a Democrat, since you're so deep in the minority, a lot of times, though not always, you have to kind of partner with a Republican to put ideas forward. When we had Senator Shoup on the show, she mentioned that she basically did that during her time in the House, where she came up with an idea and went to a Republican and said, can you sponsor this so we could get to the finish line? And you can't really do that if you don't talk to the other side, essentially. So.
Well, and a great example of that is this human trafficking legislation. I'm not the lead sponsor on it. Representative Kevin Austin out of Springfield, Missouri is the lead sponsor, and I'm fine with that. I think that in order to be successful, I, as a member of the minority party, need to be comfortable with not getting credit for things that get done. But I know, in my heart that I'm going to be a part of getting some things done.
Now, one of the things that's being pushed by some legislators, including like Caleb Rowden, I think has a bill on this, has to do with the growth of 501c4s in Missouri, which are groups. Many of them are political groups. As long as they spend at least just under 50% of their money on politics, that they can be 501c4, but they don't have to
So-called
identify
social welfare nonprofits.
Correct, and they do not have to identify their donors. And there's been a high-profile one that was just formed within the last week. So there's a growing number of those in the state who are trying to lobby for or against legislation. In the case of this particular one, they are lobbying against any sort of Medicaid expansion.
What's it called?
It's the Missouri Century Foundation, and one of our previous guests, Greg Keller, is one of the top guys in it. Also, Rich Chrismer, and actually a number of pretty prominent Republican operatives or consultants or activists are involved. And I'm not knocking the group at all. I'm just saying this is like one of the latest. There's a number of others. Former State Rep Carl Bearden's been head of one for quite a while.
But I know this has been. I remember after the 12 election cycle, Republicans were talking about basically exposing the donors to 501c4s after the Kinderlager matchup, after
Correct.
the Miranda situation. And even though Todd Richardson and Jay Barnes were talking about it, I don't think they ever introduced legislation, and nothing really came of it. So what's kind of the prospects this year, and why have things changed?
Well, and here's one thing. Keller says one of their key objectives is to fight any bill that tries to require that the donors be identified, because 501c4s are formed under federal legislation, and they believe that the state can't require that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no tax expert, but I don't see how Missouri can do anything. The 501c3 and 501c4 status is through the federal government. I don't know how we could do something unique to Missouri in that regard.
But are you seeing more active presence by them and stuff, either promoting or objecting to legislation?
The thing is like day-to-day activities in Jefferson City, I don't actually know, who's being funded and who. And sometimes you can talk to a citizen lobbyist or a paid lobbyist and not really know like who's paying their bill. Yeah. So I'm not overtly seeing any C4 activity.
Okay. Well, let's kind of talk about the state of the House Democrats and some political stuff. I'm cringing when I say this, but it's the politically part of politically speaking. Here are the cringes all over Missouri.
That was a great one.
There's only 44 Democrats in the 163-member House, which is pretty low.
And
historically low, I think.
And you had a situation.
The number changed.
You had a situation a couple months ago where Linda Black, who was a socially conservative Democrat, became a Republican, and then a frankly bizarre situation this week where Keith English, who's was a Democrat from Florissant, announced that he was an independent. And okay, the situations are different. I know Linda Black was more socially conservative, and maybe she saw this as an opportunity to be more influential by going to the majority. The Keith English thing, I just would like to know, from a Democratic member, what is going on there, basically?
Well, he's hard to get to know. I'll just say that politely. I think that he really enjoys drama, and I know a lot of public officials tend to be more dramatic, but I think he had this kind of orchestrated all along. He seemed very motivated to have a big office in Jefferson City. And for those that don't know, the majority party, so in this case the Republicans, have bigger and better offices than the Democrats do. I really could care less that my office feels like a coat closet, because that's, you're just in there to work on the computer. It doesn't need to be.
Just as a quick aside, Clint Zweifel had one of those coat closet offices, and he's doing great now.
Yeah, exactly. You can survive a small office.
But continue.
So anyway, Representative English voted with the Republicans on a draconian tax bill that the
last
session, and was rewarded for voting with the Republicans by being given a very nice office on the third floor. Part of the Democratic caucus rules are that you can't take anything of value, including an office, in exchange for a vote. So our leadership within the caucus had said that until he decides to move down to the first floor into the coat closet offices with the rest of us, he was not going to get any committee assignments. So we had hit an impasse, and things kind of exploded this week.
It spiraled out of control. Somebody told me of a very fractious caucus meeting where one member, not Keith English, was basically like, well, and this was told to me before you told me offline, but it was basically like, well, when you join a group or an organization, you have to abide by the bylaws, and if you don't do that, then you shouldn't be part of that organization. And from what I heard, he responded by saying, well, by that logic, Michael Brown shouldn't have been walking in the street or he would still be alive, which caused people to basically want to kick him out of the caucus after that. That was basically what was told to me, on background.
And for listeners who have not read Jason's very good story detailing all of the English drama, you definitely go to our website, stlpublicradio.org, and you can click on Jason and read the story.
Now, he didn't comment on the caucus meeting, but one of the things that he said was basically like, well, the Democratic Party has just moved too far left for somebody who is anti-abortion rights and pro-gun rights. But the thing that kind of struck me about it is I've been following the legislative process a long time. I know new people like Ron Casey of Jefferson County, or Belinda Harris, or Ben Harris, or the former Rachel Bringer. I think she's been married and has a different last name. They were all strongly anti-abortion Democrats, but they were welcomed within their caucus because they were seen as team players. And I think that they were able to coexist with maybe some more progressive left of center liberal Democrats. So basically, you don't feel like that washes essentially.
Keith, before the caucus meeting, he had already prepared his press release and his speech. He was planning to leave the Democratic Party before we ever got together for our caucus meeting. So it was very orchestrated. I think his inflammatory remark at the caucus meeting was he was trying to provoke a response from us so that he could say we kicked him out and that he didn't leave on his own. But ultimately, we did not kick him out. He left on his own.
But the fact remains, though, the Democrats are in a super minority right now. You basically worked hard all these years to get to the legislature, and now you're at 44. And a lot of those conservative Democrats I alluded to, they might have term limited out, but their seats were replaced by Republicans. There are hardly any rural Democrats anymore. So taking this English situation aside, what do Democrats have to do to kind of reverse this slide and kind of start to gain their numbers back both in the House and the Senate?
Well, there are a lot of different things going on. The way redistricting happened, a lot of these districts are not even competitive anymore. That's why I think there were like 60 races for the state house that didn't even have 60 Republicans ran for state rep and didn't even have a Democrat running against them because I think as a party realized we didn't have a chance. So the way the district lines are drawn can be challenging, but I don't think the Democratic Party or Democratic candidates really have to change who they are or what they represent. I think our values line up with the values of the state of Missouri and the country. I just think we've had a tough year, and of course turnout was really, really low too in a lot of places.
I mean, do the Democrats do a good, in your view, do they do a good job of outlining what they're for? It seems like many times, in some cases on the national level and sometimes on the state level, I run into voters who say, well, they just don't really understand either what the Democratic Party is for, or they feel like they're weak, or the point being
or they're trying to be Republican light, essentially.
Correct.
And
Correct.
That wasn't really a problem among many St. Louis County Democrats because, as we were talking about before, many of them were very upfront about their
I ran
progressive
pro-choice and I ran pro-Medicaid expansion.
And so did Shoup, and so did Deb Lavender, who won in Kirkwood. But my point being is that a lot of the losers didn't.
Like Jeff Rorda. I don't mean to be blunt, but I've said this many times. He basically ran as a super anti-abortion, pro-gun, and after the Michael Brown situation, very pro-law enforcement, which I think he genuinely believes.
Mm-hmm. He's a former
cop.
officer.
But those other two issues, he wasn't known as in the legislature as either of those things before he was elected to a fourth term. And I think that there was very little distinctions between him and Paul Whelan. In some ways, Paul Whelan may have been a little bit more to the left of Rorda because Paul Whelan is against the death penalty. So you had a very strange situation there, and I think that might have been a big reason why he lost, because there's no distinctions between the candidates, and it was a red wave in Jefferson County per se.
Yeah.
So
I
as
think,
a Democrat,
I think
what do you think?
One example that that your question reminds me of is this past November's elections, many states passed increases in minimum wage, which is a Democratic Party issue and value, but yet the Democrats got clobbered in those states. So I think that as a Democrat, I want to be a part of helping to connect what we stand for with the actual candidates, so that, because it just makes no sense that minimum wage increases pass, but a lot of Democrats lose as candidates. So I think we need to do a better job of tying the Democratic values to the people.
All right, I'm going to cut us off here. You can read all of our stories at stlpublicradio.org, including Jason's story about the caucus meeting. You can follow me on Twitter at @CSMcDaniel. Jason, you can be followed on Twitter.
Jay Rosenbaum.
And Joe?
You can follow me at jmannis. That's JMANNIES.
And Representative.
Yeah, you can follow me
Twitter.
on Twitter as well, Tracy McCreery.
We'll be back next week. Until then, so long.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.